Hey there, welcome back to Cycle Power Summit 2019. I'm your co-host, Melissa Buchan, and I've got something extra special for you today. Well, he's extra special to me. It's my husband, Chris Buchan. Now, I decided to invite my husband to the summit to share his economic insight into women's health. I hope you benefit from this conversation. And I will say it's a little bit of a sneak peek into what our dinner conversations look like. So I'll begin by introducing Chris. He's an economist and a consultant who specializes in applying empirical economic and statistical models into a wide range of issues and industries. And, what's most relevant to our conversation today is his work in the healthcare industry, including branded and generic pharmaceutical manufacturers, pharmacies, health insurance companies, hospitals, and other healthcare providers. Basically, he's a numbers guy with a deep curiosity and a solid understanding of economics and how it impacts our societal structures. He's also an executive professor at Texas A&M University's Mays Business School. He teaches graduate and undergraduate students how to apply statistic economics and valuation principles to business settings. He has also lectured in the area of economic healthcare in the United States, and that's what we are going to be talking about today. So, Mr. Buchan, welcome to the Cycle Power Summit.
Thank you, Mrs. Buchan. Glad to be here.
Yes. Okay. So, I decided to have you on to the summit a couple of weeks ago. So I want to give listeners a little bit of background to how this conversation started. It really came about when the FDA announced its approval of brexanolone. So this is a treatment for postpartum depression. But the thing is, it comes with a 60-hour infusion and a price tag of $34,000. And it's essentially a derivative of progesterone. And knowing what I know, I was blown away by this news and a little bit confused. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm ecstatic to know that there's research in the area of postpartum depression. Women need this help. But I'm also a little frustrated behind, the expense and the modalities of how they're delivering this. So, we were walking our dogs one evening and I came to you with my question. And as you always do, you take my question seriously and we dove into a conversation. So that's where I want to start with our conversation today in the summit. I'm just going to begin by asking you that same question. So, here we are in a time when our country is trying to save costs on pharmaceuticals. Why in the world are doctors prescribing a medication and why are patients taking a medication that costs $34,000 when a lot of the doctors that I work with are prescribing bioidentical progesterone treatments at a very low cost and getting excellent results?
Sure. And it seems like a simple question. Why does healthcare, not just pharmaceuticals, but why does healthcare in the United States cost so much? And the costs are only increasing, and that's well documented in studies and research. And what I do and what I tell students when we talk about the economics of U.S. healthcare is when you ask about how markets work, in economics, we call, the buying and selling of goods or services markets. When you ask why something is priced a certain way or why do only these manufacturers or these sellers sell this particular product, no matter what it is, there are answers to that. There are usually market structures and those types of things that result in what we have. And so when somebody says prescription drug prices are too high, economists like to look at it and say, why is that? And the answer to that is manifold. So it's not just one thing. It's not just greedy pharmaceutical manufacturers, although they do have a role in this, as we'll probably talk about today. But it is part and parcel the structure, the way that the industry has set up, the healthcare industry generally and prescription drugs specifically, is the result of many factors. And that includes, we'll talk about those today, the drug industry itself, so the pharmaceutical manufacturers, the people who are buying and selling and making payments, and government and regulations and health insurance providers and those sorts of entities. So it's a very unique market compared to what we normally experience, say buying t-shirts or cars or going to restaurants. And it's important to know, well, it can be important to know, it's important for me to know what those differences are and why things are the way they are.
Okay, so can we start with just you helping the audience to understand a bit about the structure of the pharmaceutical industry in the United States? What does that look like?
Sure. And the common place to start that I like to start is to first define some terms, if you will. And so stepping aside from the healthcare industry, because then we'll use those terms in the healthcare industry, let's just take a normal market that most people can relate to, say the buying and selling of cars. Okay, so in the buying and selling of cars, you have a pretty clear consumer. That's the person buying the car. So let's say that I'm going to a dealership to look for a new sedan, and I've got a budget, and I'm looking at different models and different features and that sort of thing. And I inform myself about what those characteristics that a particular car or model have and what my needs are. And so I'm the informed consumer, and I go to the seller, in this case, the dealer, the auto dealership, and I look at the price. Usually the price is there on the window. And so it's posted, it's transparent is what we call it in economics. And so you have price transparency. Here is the price. Now it's negotiable typically, especially in the car industry, but even if it's not, you have a price, you know what it is, and you know what the features are, you know what it is. And you're informed, and you can either buy or not buy that product. And so in the case of a car, typically I'm the one buying it. Now you might take a loan or finance it or lease it or something like that, but I'm still responsible as the consumer for paying for it. So now that we've set all that up, that's the way a market typically works. So how does healthcare in the United States work, and many other countries for that matter? Well, so in healthcare in the United States, the consumer is typically the patient, and I use those terms interchangeably, and that's not to be insensitive, but patients are consumers of healthcare. And so the consumer in this case would go to typically the doctor, their physician, their healthcare provider is what we generally call professionals in the healthcare industry. And they will go to them with symptoms or, for specific treatment, or not even knowing what the treatment is. And so as you can see already, they're probably less informed. Typically, the patient is usually less informed. They may not have the expertise to know what features, say, on a car. Does it have a radio? Does it get certain fuel mileage? For healthcare, it's a very different thing. It can be kind of a black box, complicated for many people. And so you might not have what we call a well-informed consumer, a well-informed patient. And so that's what we call in economics information asymmetry. That's where somebody in the transaction knows more than the other party. So in this case,
it would be the physician knows more than the patient or consumer, but the patient or consumer is going to be the one taking the product.
Right. And as we'll talk about here in a little while, information asymmetry in all sorts of markets can lead to what we call kind of a diversion from the competitive norm. So, and that's usually higher prices or lower output or a combination of those. So there's this information asymmetry. And so now let's go to the seller side. So the seller side, when you go, say, for a prescription and the physician prescribes something, they are making the decision for you. So this is what we call decision rights. Who has decision rights in a transaction? So typically the decision, like in the auto example, the consumer is making the decision. Here you have a physician or a healthcare provider that is making the purchase decision, what they recommend. Now, ultimately you have to approve it and you have to go to the pharmacy to fill the prescription, but generally they're recommending to you what car you should buy. And you don't know otherwise. Typically, most patients don't know otherwise, or they don't disagree. They just take the healthcare providers' guidance and experience, which can be good. That's not a bad thing. But what's interesting about that, you've probably noticed, is the physician's not going to pay anything out of their pocket for your treatment. And so they're making decisions for what types of products and services you're consuming, but they have no skin in the game, for a lack of a better phrase. And so
wouldn't the skin in the game be the benefit of their patient? Because ultimately they are in the place to serve their patient and be in the best interest of their patient.
That's absolutely right. And you caught me on that one. That's good, as you normally do. And so when I say skin in the game, I was limiting it to financial
Okay, right,
requirement.
right.
So whether or
This
not
is
you're financially obligated to pay for a certain product. Now,
yeah.
physicians have all sorts of obligations, most of it litigious, because they want to make sure they do the best treatment for a patient. And we may get into that later. Otherwise, they could be at risk of a lawsuit, for example. And so there's plenty of examples of why, for altruistic, obviously they have the Hippocratic Oath, and they want to do well for their customers and patients, but there's also risks if they don't. So, and that's all good. That those are good systems that have been put in place, typically by law and the government, to make sure that patients are getting the care that they need, and
Mhm.
that's all good. But to be clear, the physicians who are choosing what care to take or to consume don't bear any direct financial responsibility for paying for it. And that's not a knock on physicians. That's just the way it works.
Mhm.
But people would say, well, the consumer then pays for it. And as most people know in the United States specifically, the out-of-pocket, what we call an out-of-pocket expenditure, that is what is directly paid at the time of consumption of healthcare services, in this case, say a prescription drug, is typically far less than the total cost of care. So for prescription drugs, say a branded prescription drug, a brand is typically one that is patent protected. So it has some exclusivity, which is pretty important for pharmaceutical manufacturers, but it's also can lead to higher prices, result in higher prices, because, for lack of better phrase, they're the only ones that have that product, or at least something exactly like it. And so they can charge almost what they want for that product. Well, so if I'm going to the doctor and he has the latest and greatest prescription drug that he recommends for you, say it's a branded, what was the drug that just came out for
Oh,
postpartum?
it's Brexanolone. I think I'm saying it correctly. Yeah.
So that branded drug might cost $34,000, and the doctor might say you're going to stay in the hospital for the next 2.5 days to have that drug, because we think, we want to make sure that you don't experience postpartum depression, and this is the standard of care, and they've been informed by all sorts of parties that this is a good product, it's a safe and efficacy, it works, and so we're going to prescribe this drug.
This leads me to my next curiosity, my next question. So where are the doctors getting their information from to say, okay, this is the latest and greatest drug, this is what you need to use? And what about all of these medications that have been around for decades that are either generic or they're bioidentical, and they work just as well, if not possibly better?
Right. And so the information comes from many sources. First and foremost would be through medical training. So, through their medical school training, through their residency programs, they're informed of certain treatments, and they learn what types of medicines, for surgeons, it would be what types of procedures work and are safe. But as you get further on in specific, let's say heart doctors, there are certain new products when they come out, they're marketed by the pharmaceutical manufacturers. So they want to inform physicians, the people who are, again, making the decision for the patients. They want to inform them. And it's not necessarily nefarious. It doesn't have to be a negative thing. They want to make sure that the doctors are aware of the latest and greatest drug that came out. And I say latest and greatest, that's just maybe in air quotes I should do, but it's at least the latest drug. And we can talk about why it may not always be the greatest drug.
And let's speak to that now. Can you go into that right now?
Sure. So one of the things about the U.S. pharmaceutical industry is that to become a branded drug, you have to go through a gauntlet, if you will, of clinical trials and a process of research and development, and proving to the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, that your product is not only safe, but that it works. And we call it efficacy. It's an efficacy requirement. And that hasn't always been the case, but it is now.
So what was the case before?
Sure. So quick little history lesson is years ago. So, and I'm going to refer to my notes to get the right year, but 1906, the Food and Drugs Act was the original act, 1906. So, over 100 years ago, was the first sort of effort by the United States government to make sure that things were at least not poison. And so it was more of a safety issue when they started regulating drugs, pharmaceuticals, and all sorts of food products. It was actually largely targeted toward food products. They started using artificial ingredients and that sort of thing. And so early on, they wanted to make sure that people weren't poisoned by the food and drugs that they consumed. And so in 1906, that was the first kind of pillar. But if you'll notice, they didn't have, you've got to prove that it works too. So you have to actually prove that it does what you say it does. So fast forward to the Shirley Amendment, and this was around 1937, I think, or in the early periods, that it prohibited drug companies, or any company for that matter, from making false therapeutic claims with intent to defraud. And that sounds all legalese, but what it means is if you made a claim about your product that wasn't true and you meant it as a lie, you knew it was a lie, that was illegal. And that's really, really hard to prove. And so it really didn't grab much traction. That wasn't really an efficacy pillar that we have today. So it didn't really have any teeth to it. And so fast forward to a couple of mass illnesses and deaths through, one of them was diethylene glycol, killed over 100 people, including a lot of children. In 1938, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, we call it the FDC, was implemented, and it added cosmetics and medical devices to the list of products that would be reviewed. And it also not only required, that you proved safety before you marketed a product, which was kind of in the original one, but not really, didn't have much teeth to it. And it eliminated the Shirley component, the earlier Shirley Act of intent. So you didn't have to intend to say that something worked when you didn't, when you knew it didn't. And so it kind of had a little bit more teeth. Fast forward to thalidomide babies, which a lot of people are familiar with. And in 1962, so we're almost 60 years after the original Food and Drug Act, they began making amendments, and ultimately in 1962, they required efficacy proof. The FDA did. They didn't really have a process to do that yet, but that worked its way out in the courts over the next roughly decade. And ultimately Congress, or the Supreme Court, I should say, the Supreme Court ultimately ruled that it was legal for the federal government to require the efficacy proof. And so over the next, so we're all the way in 1970. That's not that long ago. It's, 40, 50 years ago is when the United States government said, look, we don't want you to just make sure that it's not poison, whatever you're selling. We also want you to prove that it does what you say it does.
Okay, so fair enough. So, good approach to making sure that pharmaceuticals that we're pushing out to the public are both safe and effective. I can see that that's probably benefited a lot of the drugs that are on the market, but how has it hindered the process of getting drugs pushed through, and how specifically has it affected the price and cost of getting a drug approved?
Sure. So basically it's increased the cost dramatically. So the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, is the one that oversees approval for drugs. And so if you want to market, if you're a company and you want to market a particular product, let's say natural progesterone, and you can create it in a lab, maybe it's synthetic, or you can actually create the bioidentical progesterone, and you want to market it for, say, postpartum depression, you have to get FDA approval and demonstrate through clinical trials, human clinical trials, originally maybe through animals and stuff like that, but ultimately you have to prove through 3 phases of clinical trials with the FDA that it is safe and that it works for what you're treating, in this case, say, postpartum depression. That process can take decades and millions, if not billions of dollars to go through that gauntlet of clinical trials. And so, and only a small fraction, less than 10% of all drugs that begin through phase 1, the first hurdle, make it through to the end for what we call a new drug approval, NDA. So if you're talking about possibly years at least, if not decades of research, you're talking about 1 in 10 drugs even make it through the gauntlet. And that's just assuming that you even get to phase 1 in the first place. So they can spend billions and billions of dollars on hundreds of different molecules trying to test which one should even start going through clinical trials. So you can clearly see that trying to prove efficacy can be very, very costly, both in terms of time and money.
Mhm.
And so if you have something that works and you think it works, or you even know it works, but you still have to go through that process with the FDA to prove it. And that, as you said earlier, that certainly has its benefits. I think we are better off generally, and this is all just an opinion, but that we prove not only that something is safe, doesn't poison you, that's clearly a good thing, but that it works as well. And
so can you speak to this idea that there are therapies on the market that aren't FDA approved for specific treatments, but evidence-based medicine shows that it works well? Such as, for example, since we're on this topic of progesterone, so the micronized progesterone prometrium is, I think it's just two treatments that it's approved for. But we use it for a whole host of things with restorative reproductive medicine and cycle-targeted therapies.
Right, that's what we call, or the industry calls, off-label marketing. So okay. It's basically the label itself is what the label is actually approved by the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. So the FDA says, here's the label that you can put on your bottle, actually on the packaging inserts that go with the bottle of pills or medicines. And whatever that label says it's for is what the FDA says that you have proven that it's for. And so off-label means it hasn't gone through the gauntlet with the FDA to show and to get FDA approval to have this on the label, but people know that it works. And
so many people say, well, why not? Why can't you go through this process? Well, as you've explained, it takes decades and a whole heck of a lot of money to push that through. So
right. Sorry to interrupt, but you can make that money back. It can make economic sense if you, for example, can charge a high price or make that money back after you make it through phase 4 and get FDA approval. Mm-hmm. The problem with, say, an old product that is no longer patent protected, patent gives you exclusivity. The patent says nobody else can make this for the duration of the patent term. It could be, 10 years or more, 17 years. And the government does that. They allow people to have patents and exclusivity to encourage you to innovate in the first place. They say, look, if you put in all the millions and billions of dollars of research, we'll give you some exclusivity. You'll be the only one in the block that can sell this for a while so that you can try to recoup your money. And so going back to the less than 1 in 10 get through this gauntlet, if that happens and they've spent billions of dollars and this is the only drug that comes through, they're going to be incentivized. I say they have to. They will be incentivized to try to make that money back as quickly as possible before the patent goes off expiry. And so going back to natural progesterone or an older product, it's probably not patent protected any longer, especially some drugs, heart medications, for example, that have been around since the 40s that still work. They're not going to try and prove and spend millions and millions of dollars trying to prove that it works for this new use if they can't get exclusivity and patent protection, so that as soon as they get through that, they can't charge whatever they want. Well, they could, but somebody else will just come in behind them and charge less. And that's what generics do. That's effectively what a generic drug does. As soon as a branded drug goes off patent, a generic comes in and they will basically charge cost. And so that's why people say, how come a drug costs $34,000 when it only, or to a consumer, to people who consume that, when it only costs literally maybe $100 or $10 to make it in the first place. And the reason for that is all that research and development time, expense that went into getting it approved. They're trying to make that money back. And so it's not all about evil, and it's not all about evil pharmaceutical companies. There's a rhyme and reason for what they're doing. And the result of brands being able to get a lot of money for those drugs, in theory, and I say that carefully, is that they would reinvest those profits back into continuing to research and develop new therapies in the future. And that does happen. Mm-hmm. And the question is, what is one question that economists I think struggle with, and I struggle with, is, and I don't think there's a single answer, is what is the optimum level of research and development that we would like? Clearly we want good research and development, and we want drug companies to be incentivized to continue to improve. But the question is, are they spending the research and development dollars in the right places, like, for example, say cancer therapies, or are they just simply researching novel or small incremental changes to existing therapies that work fairly well already, just so that they can continue to extend patent life, brand status, and keep the prices high? And I think you see a lot of both of that. You see a lot of good research and development going on. You also see a lot of pharmaceutical manufacturers that strategically pick certain markets with relatively minor incremental innovations. They are allowed to continue to extend their brand status through a new patent exclusivity period.
So how long does a patent typically last?
It depends on several things. Pharmaceutical industry is a little bit different, but generally a patent can be 10 to 17 years.
Okay. So I'm just curious, given the topic of the summit, is the birth control pill in that area where they're constantly tweaking and making new innovations to keep that brand status and increase prices?
That's exactly right. It's part of the strategy. I mean, there are explicit, deliberate, and they should be doing this, strategies to try to make sure that they continue to develop and brand and market products. They can generate returns to pay for the research and development. And some of that involves continually, like, extended dose therapies are a common one. So you have a drug maybe that even intentionally was originally released in a 12.5 milligram dosage, and you had to take 3 a day. And maybe they even knew that we could probably do a 1 a day version at some point, but they hold off on it to get exclusivity under the 3 a day, and then a couple years later release a 1 a day version.
Okay. All right.
That happens, and that's something that I think the industry struggles with, and I think it's something that it seems like some regulators are paying a little bit more attention to, and namely, I'm talking about the FTC, who kind of handles the pharmaceutical industry and some of their business practices.
So, in the area of, you're very familiar, of course, in the work that I do, and I think you understand my frustration that there's always, the therapies work great. Restorative reproductive medicine is a really beautiful approach to helping women get to the root cause and solving issues, but it just isn't taking off. And I've always said it's not taking off because there's not enough money to be made in the modalities that are being prescribed. So, that's kind of my little conspiracy theory. Can you speak to that? Am I way off, or are you backing me on this?
Well, you can call it a conspiracy theory. I just call it rational economics. So, if somebody wants to devote, again, going back to the FDA, and I'm not saying that it's all the blame or anything of the FDA, but if you're going to spend millions of dollars, and if we have a system in place that controls what you can sell in a certain market, whether it be prescription drugs or anything, like cars to a lesser extent, we have certain requirements for fuel efficiency and stuff like that. And it does the same thing. It raises the cost of those products because they have to put more research and development into making more energy efficient vehicles. And usually we have no problem with that in the car sector because, well, cars, while most people should be able to buy a car if they want, it's not life and death like with healthcare. So with healthcare, you have companies who are out there that would like to market products, they would like to sell products, but we have decided, I think, as a country long ago, that we don't want people to just be able to come in and say that something works for something as serious as, say, postpartum depression without proving that it does. And that's costly. And so you're set up with this reality in the United States specifically, where a lot of the research and development goes through, and the FDA kind of sets the standard for a lot of the world in this regard, which we can get into later. But that's part of the reason why the US prescription drug prices are so much higher than overseas, is that the FDA kind of sets the standard for the world on what works and what doesn't and what's safe. Okay. And you have to pay for it.
Okay. And you keep saying we can get into these things later. Honey, we only have 30 minutes for this interview and our time is almost up. So I want to ask, what have I not covered? What have I not asked? What would you also like to cover in our last few minutes together talking about economics of the pharmaceutical industry and women's health care?
Sure. And I think one of the most important things I tell students, and I tell people, just friends and you, anybody I can, when you're talking about healthcare, it is understandable that it seems like a very, very complex, it is a very complex thing. And so, but with the internet, and I'm not saying just go to WebMD and decide that you have cancer because you have sniffles, but inform yourself. I think that's the most important thing. When you go to a physician and they prescribe a branded drug, I say, ask what the alternatives are. And is the branded drug that they're prescribing because they just had a pharmaceutical rep come by and give them free samples and tell them about the good things that this new drug does? But how much better is it than the alternative? What is the alternative? Inform yourself. Don't be afraid to ask your healthcare provider, your doctor, questions. There's nothing, and if your doctor doesn't like an informed patient, you should probably find another doctor.
Yeah.
And I think most doctors are receptive to that. Now, if you're wasting their time and asking, conspiracy theory type questions, that's another thing. But if you're just trying to become an informed consumer, an informed patient, I think they should be receptive to that. And there are a lot of times where you might be spending a lot more on a particular product or drug than you need to be. And I mean, that's one of the things that is interesting and maybe could be changed in regulations in the future. And I think the FTC has mentioned possibly looking into this, is the FDA doesn't require that you prove that it works better than something else. It just requires that you prove that it works at all. And so when you have a brand new drug come out into the market, they don't have to prove, say, a new heart therapy or drug. You don't have to prove how much better it is than the generic that's been out there that's $5. You just have to prove that it works. And then what they do after they get approval and the FDA says, yep, you're right, it works, they go out and market it that it's better, typically.
Yeah, there's a lot to say for a good marketing campaign. So I love what you're saying here because it goes so well with what we are promoting in the Cycle Power Summit of being informed. And women can be informed by charting their cycles, knowing this information so that they have their own user manual to them that they're taking to their doctor and saying, hey, this is what I have going on. And can you use this information to come up with a treatment plan specifically for my needs? And then they're not looking at the latest and greatest, but okay, what exactly are you needing? And I think we've had this conversation before that, a doctor may be hesitant to prescribe something that is off label to a patient who's not informed. But if a patient says, hey, I'm charting, we're going to go back to that progesterone example because that's what we've used throughout this conversation. And, I think my progesterone levels, my luteal phase was very short, and I'm really struggling with premenstrual syndrome. Can you test my progesterone levels? And could we look at maybe a natural progesterone to supplement? Well, if you are coming to them with that, well, sure, they're not going to be as hesitant to prescribe that off-label use because you're asking for it.
Absolutely. It kind of removes some of the, as we would say, a liability that a physician might face for prescribing something that's off-label, is if you bring it up and you ask about it. And then oftentimes a physician would be far more willing, in my experience, would be far more willing to prescribe something if you're informed and you ask for it.
Good. Okay.
Or ask about it.
So I think our time is coming to a close. I do want to respect the time parameters of the interview. And we were asking all of our interviewers at the end of our time together what their cycle power tip is. So Mr. Buchan, what is your cycle power tip for the summit?
I guess I would say, as a husband of somebody who teaches it, I have probably benefited as much as you have from knowing the power of your cycle, and I guess our cycle in some respects. I know when to, as you know, when the chocolates are the appropriate one, when to maybe run.
Yeah. When to run, like run out the door and far away.
When to run and hide.
When to hide and when to bring home chocolates. Good. Okay. Great advice to close this interview with. Okay. Thank you for taking time out of your busy day. I'll get back to doing what you do, and I'll get back to doing what I do, and I will see you tonight at the dinner table.
Thank you. Have a good night.
All right. Thank you so much, and we will see everybody else in the next session.